Okay, welcome back. So we're going to talk now about a little bit of our overall brain anatomy. So looking at some of our neuroanatomy, and we'll also look at a little bit of our brain development. So when looking at our brain from an external view, there's four general parts. Primarily from an external view, these are the areas we can see. There's a bit of an exception, as we'll see. So the first part is something called the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is this large part that we see right here, all outlined by my cursor here. So hopefully you can see my cursor. This is known as the cerebrum. Now, within the cerebrum, or as part of the cerebrum, in each side, so there's two hemispheres that are divided by something called the longitudinal fissure. Uh, each hemisphere, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, has four lobes that we can see from an external view. And we'll see there's actually a fifth one that we can't see from this view here. And these are named according to the bone of the cranium that is overlying that particular lobe. So if you remember from skeletal system, you have your frontal lobe, or your frontal bone right here. So guess what the name of this lobe is? This is the frontal lobe, right? Here we had a parietal bone, so this is the parietal lobe. Here we had the occipital bone, so this is the occipital lobe. And then here we had the temporal bone, so this is the temporal lobe. So these lobes are named very, very descriptively according to the bone that overlies it. Okay. Now the fifth lobe is something called the insular lobe. All right. So the insular lobe, let me get some color here. So if we were to pull this part up and we were to pull this lobe down, somewhere in this area right here, we would have a lobe that is called, it's bigger than this circle, but it's called the insula, or the insular lobe. This is a more primitive region of the brain, but we cannot see it from a superficial view like this. So we have to remove or separate the portions of the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. So that is the cerebrum. The second one here is called the diencephalon. The diencephalon is an area that you can't see from an external view, but it's located in this general region kind of right in here. So if you were to go into the brain, we would find it somewhere in this area. And we'll see this is where our what's called our third ventricle, we'll talk about that, is located. This is the general area of where our thalamus is located, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Okay. We also have our brainstem. So our brainstem is this structure that we see right down here, and the brainstem is continuous inferiorly with our spinal cord, where it passes through that foramen magnum. And we'll see that the brainstem has three general parts. There's a region called the midbrain, there's a region called the medulla, and there's a region called the pons as well. All right. So the last region here is this kind of small structure we see back here. This is the cerebellum. So cerebellum translates to small brain. And so if you look at it, it's kind of a miniature version of our cerebrum. And our cerebellum is going to be primarily involved with functions such as proprioception, functions regarding the location of our joints and our limbs and our bones and our ligaments and whatnot. Also having functions related to muscle control, posture, and kind of fine-tuning and smoothing out our movements. All right, so we will continue here. So whenever we look at our adult brain, so whenever we look at this brain here, how do we get to this structure here? So what we start off with is we start off with something called the neural plate. So this is something called the neural plate, this blue region that we see right up here. This is called the neural plate, all right? So during embryological development, this neural plate begins to kind of fold backwards on itself that we see right here, okay? So you start to fold back, and then you call this region the neural groove because there's an opening right here. There's this opening that is resulting in this thing being called the neural groove, and then ultimately it closes. And so when it closes, we get something called the neural tube that we see right here. So the neural tube essentially and ultimately gives rise to our adult brain, and we have something called brain vesicles. So these brain vesicles right here, these ultimately give rise to our adult brain structures. And so you can look over here at this region right here, and you can see all of these are our adult brain structures. So we talked about the cerebrum, we talked about the thalamus briefly, we talked about the midbrain, pons, cerebellum, medulla. So we ultimately give rise to our adult brain structures, starting with this circular neural tube. Now, you can see this neural tube, it is open in the middle, right? So it is hollow. We actually retain this neural tube, we retain this opening in our brain as something called the ventricles, or the ventricular system of the brain. So in our brains, our adult brains, we actually have these openings. We have these holes, if you will, these spaces or these cavities within our brain, and they're not really completely empty. They actually contain something called cerebrospinal fluid, and we'll talk about what cerebrospinal fluid is and how we get it. So, whenever we look at our cerebrum, if we were to cut into our brain, we're cut into the cerebrum, or you cut into the cerebellum, or honestly you cut into the spinal cord, you'll find different colored tissues, okay? And so there's something that accounts for this coloration of different parts of our brain. So if you remember when we talked about action potentials, and we talked about cells, and we talked about neurons and whatnot, we mentioned this term called myelin, right? So think for a second what myelin is, and I'll continue here, but myelin is a lipid fatty substance that coats and covers some of our neurons in our nervous system. And if you recall, the myelin allows the action potential to proceed more quickly down the neuron, which allows for a faster propagation of the action potential from one cell or one neuron to its next neuron, or to the next cell, or to the postsynaptic cell, right? So in areas of our nervous system where we do not have myelin, or we have portions of myelinated axons that don't contain myelin, or portions of myelinated neurons that don't contain myelin, we'll call this gray matter. Gray because it's not white, right? So the myelin around our neurons has a white coloration to it. So if you remember, the axons of our neurons were the ones that usually had myelin. Now you can have unmyelinated axons, as we'll see right here, but we also have dendrites, and we also have the cell bodies of our neurons. Those do not ever contain myelin. So when you see gray matter, you can think primarily this is where the cell bodies of my neurons are going to be located. So if you see this outer region, all out here called the cortex, this outer region all right here that's being highlighted in red, this is all a region called the cerebral cortex. It is the superficial layer. There's different subdivisions or sublayers of the cerebral cortex. But in general, this is where we have our cell bodies, our dendrites. This is where they're located, all right? Now, within our central nervous system, we said that we can have these cell bodies right here that we're talking about. If you clump and you cluster these cell bodies together into one large mass, within the central nervous system, you're going to call that a nucleus, okay? So a nucleus in this case is not the same thing as like the nucleus of an atom with protons and neutrons. It is not the same thing as a nucleus in a cell that contains our genetic information in the form of DNA. But a nucleus in this case is a cluster of cell bodies, right? So what we see right here, a cluster of cell bodies that is within the central nervous system, okay? So you can actually see a few nuclei right here. So you can see a small one here. You can see a larger one right here. You can see another one right over in here, right? So these are nuclei. They're clusters of cell bodies, and they're in the brain here. So they're in the central nervous system, right? We'll see when we talk about peripheral nervous system that there is a specific name or a term given to clusters of cell bodies outside the central nervous system or in the peripheral nervous system, and we'll talk about that whenever we get there. Okay? So if you know what gray matter is, then you know what white matter, and it consists of the myelinated axons. Okay, so all of this tissue that we see in here, that is all this red region, all in this area here. This is all white matter. You can also see some projections extending down here and extending down here. This is all white matter. Now, when we have white matter within the central nervous system that is kind of bundled together, we're going to call this a tract. Now, whenever we do a lecture talking about specific motor pathways or sensory pathways in the spinal cord, we'll call these different tracts. So there's spinal thalamic tracts, and there's these corticospinal tracts. These are specific pathways in the central nervous system that either transmit sensory information to the central nervous system or motor information out of the central nervous system. Okay. So whenever we look at a section of the spinal cord here in a little while, we'll also see that we have this white matter, and we'll see gray matter as well. So here we can see these same things. So we can see this outer layer, this outer cerebral cortex of gray matter, this inner region here of white matter with these projections coming through. Oops, let me go back. With these projections coming through right here. Okay, and again, these tracks are how we're relaying both sensory and motor information to and from the central nervous system. Right. So next thing we'll talk about are some important structures like the meninges, our ventricles, CSF, and something called the blood-brain barrier. So we will stop here and we will pick up with this in our next part.